espresso button.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Dame i gospodo, dobrodošli. Prije nego što počnem, nadam se da je svako imao priliku da uzme handout od jednog papira vezano za profesorovu izlaganje i kome treba ove slušalice za simultani prevod. Uvažavajući naše goste, ja ću nastaviti na engleskom. On behalf of the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Montenegro, I'd like to welcome you all to today's lecture on the existence of God, delivered by our distinguished guest, Dr. Richard Swinburne, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. Today's lecture is part of a research project titled Beyond the Anticlerical Paradigm, Rethinking Secularism in Contemporary Montenegro. The project is conducted by our institute and is supported by the University of Oxford through a generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation. Before I introduce our guest, I hope you will allow me to say a few words about the project. 4 years ago, our country experienced significant political changes, in which, as I'm sure you know, the Orthodox Church has played a pivotal role. These events have fundamentally disrupted what we in our institute have called the anti-clerical paradigm, namely a conception of secularism that is inherently antagonistic towards religion and which for decades had dominantly shaped our society's understanding of religion's role in the public sphere, of religion's relationship to science, and of the appropriate scope of religious organizations' involvement in political processes. So in light of these recent political developments, we believe that there is a need to systematically reflect on the meanings of such terms as secularism, secularity, secularization, and desecularization within our unique cultural and socio-political context. Our project aims to contribute to that reflection. What does it mean to say that religious organizations are separate from the state? Should secularism be understood primarily as protecting the freedom of religion and of religious organization from persecution by the state? Or should it be understood as curtailing the influence of the religious organization and of religion in the public sphere? Is religious argumentation or religiously inspired argumentation admissible in political discourse? And if so, under which circumstances and under which conditions is it admissible? To be able to meaningfully reflect on any of these questions regarding the role and place of religion in contemporary society, we thought it was important to first get a grasp on some of the questions that pertain to the core content of religious belief. And that brings me to our guest. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Richard Swinburne. Professor Swinburne is one of the most eminent philosophers of religion of our time, whose work has profoundly shaped contemporary discussions on the existence of God, on the coherence of theism, as well as on the interplay between faith and reason. Professor Swinburne began his academic journey studying philosophy, politics, and economics at Exeter College, Oxford, where he developed his deep interest in philosophical theology. He later earned his DPhil, Doctor of Philosophy, at the Oxford University, and went on to teach at several prestigious institutions, including the University of Hull, the University of Kiel, and the University of Oxford, where he was Nolloth Professor of the Philosophy of Christian Religion from 1985 to 2002. In 1993, he was elected Fellow of the British Academy. Over the years, Professor Swinburne has authored numerous influential books, including The Coherence of Theism, The Existence of God, Faith and Reason, which together constitute a rigorous trilogy on the philosophy of theism. In these books, he systematically examines the logical coherence of the concept of God. He evaluates the evidence for God's existence and explores the rationality of religious belief. His arguments, particularly in support of theism, are known for their clarity, their analytical precision, and depth. Professor Swinburne's contributions extend beyond academia as he engages with broader audiences through public lectures, such as this one, through debates, through writings that address fundamental questions of faith, science, and the nature of existence. Today, we are fortunate to have him with us at the University of Montenegro to share his insights on that most profound and enduring question of all, namely the existence of God. Professor Swinburne will be speaking for 45 to 50 minutes, roughly. And I hope everybody had a chance to receive the handout for the lecture. The lecture will be then followed by a 40 or so minutes of Q&A, during which you're encouraged to ask questions either in English or in Serbian, Montenegrin, Croatian, Bosnian. Without further ado, please please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Swinburne.
Thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me to your audience, or your university. You all have a handout, I hope. It will help you to follow the structure of the argument. I will refer to it when I come to the relevant parts of the lecture. Different people come to believe that there is a God for different good reasons. Some people have had what seems to them to be a strong awareness of the presence of God. And in virtue of a principle which I call the principle of credulity, it is always rational to believe that things are as they seem to be, in the absence of counter evidence. If it seems to you that you hear me lecturing to you now, or that, as you seem to recall, you had dinner in a restaurant last night, or that you have a brother, it is rational to believe these things in the absence of counter evidence. And the more strongly it seems to you that these things are so, the more rational it is to believe that they are so. By counter evidence, I mean evidence that things are not as they seem to be. For example, if other people tell you you had dinner at home last night, then it's no longer rational to believe that you had dinner at a restaurant last night. Likewise, with an apparent awareness of God, in the absence of arguments to show there is no God, it is rational for someone to whom it seems that they have had a strong awareness of the presence of God, to believe that they do indeed have this awareness, and so that there is a God. Other people come to believe that there is a God on the basis of testimony. Someone whom they trust, their parents or teacher or priest, tells them that there is a God. And in virtue of the principle which I call the principle of testimony, it's always rational to believe what you are told in the absence of counter evidence, either evidence that things are not as you are told, or that your informant was in no position to know what he claims to know. After all, almost everything that we think that we know about history or science, or indeed almost anything else, we believe because we've been told it by teachers whom we trust, unless we have counter evidence of some other teachers who claim that the first teachers have made a mistake. But some people come to believe that there is a God on the basis of positive arguments for his existence. And in the 21st century Western world, even those who have had strong apparent experiences of the presence of God, or have been taught by their parents that there is a God, they also need arguments to back up their belief, for they will be aware of counter-arguments, arguments purporting to show that their belief in a God is a delusion, and so they need arguments to show that these counter-arguments are not sound, and they need positive arguments from phenomena evident to the senses to show that there is a God. There is, I think, greater need for such arguments, arguments of what is called natural theology, greater need for such arguments than in any earlier period of Christian history. And majority Christian tradition has always, at least until the 19th century, held that cogent arguments of this kind are available for those who need them. St. Paul famously claimed pagans who did not worship God were, I quote, without excuse, because, I quote, ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things that he has made. Close quote. Inspired by this text, very many Christian thinkers, East and West, from the 2nd to the 18th centuries, including Irenaeus, Athanasius, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor, John of Damascus, Thomas Aquinas, and Duns Scotus, have crafted such arguments. They were claiming, in effect, that by the secular criteria of what is evidence for what, the existence and nature of the physical universe and the humans who inhabit it make it probable that God made it and sustained it. They were claiming that on public criteria, the existence and nature of the physical world and of us made it probable that there is God. The arguments which I am about to present to you for that same conclusion are in that tradition. But today we know a lot more than they did about the nature of the universe and the nature of its human inhabitants, and also a lot more than they did about the criteria of what is evidence for what. And so their arguments for the existence of God need to be rephrased in more modern terms. In this lecture, I shall seek to do just that, and to show you that theism, the hypothesis, or theory, I shall use these words in the same sense, that there is a God, is very probably true. It is an explanatory hypothesis. An explanatory hypothesis is one which purports to explain why certain observed phenomena, data or evidence, are as they are. Many scientific or historical hypotheses are explanatory hypotheses. They purport to explain data which the scientist has obtained in his laboratory, or the archaeologist or detective has discovered in the course of an archaeological or forensic examination. I shall show that theism explains the four most general phenomena evident to the senses. My evidence, are that there is a physical universe at all, that physical objects behave in regular ways, coded by scientific laws, that there are human bodies, and that humans are conscious beings. And I shall show that it does so explain these phenomena far better than any other explanation that can be put forward. And that makes it very probable that it is true. For reasons of time, I shall only mention briefly the main evidence often adduced against the existence of God, the fact of much human suffering, and I shall explain very briefly why I think that that evidence does not count against the existence of God. But I shall discuss that issue more fully in the follow-up seminar, which I shall be giving tomorrow. So now, to show why the very obvious positive evidence for which I have listed is strong evidence for the existence of God. Now, you have this handout, and you will need to follow it. And then we're on the first paragraph of the handout. There are two basic kinds of explanatory hypothesis. personal hypotheses and inanimate or scientific hypotheses. A personal hypothesis explains some phenomenon in terms of it being caused by a substance, that is, a thing, a person, acting with certain powers to bring about effects, certain beliefs about how to do so, and a certain purpose or intention to bring about a particular effect, either for its own sake or for a step towards a further effect. Thus, my getting on an aeroplane yesterday may be explained by a substance, me, in virtue of my powers, including the ability to walk up the gangplank, my belief that the plane would take me to Podgorica, and my purpose to get to Podgorica. These explain the motion of my body onto the aeroplane. Person, a thing with powers, beliefs, and purposes which he or she is trying to realize through their body. That's one sort of explanation. An inanimate or scientific explanation is usually represented as explaining some phenomenon in terms of it being caused by some initial state of affairs and the operation on that state of affairs of the laws of nature. The present positions of the planets are explained by their earlier positions and that of the Sun and the operation on them of Newton's laws of gravity. But I think that this is a misleading way of analyzing inanimate explanation because laws are not things. To say that Newton's law of gravity is a law is simply to say that each material body in the universe, every atom there is in the universe, has the power to attract every other material body with a force proportional to the square of their the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart, and the liability to exercise that power on every other such body. So construed, personal explanation is like inanimate, so construed, like personal explanation, inanimate explanation of some phenomenon, for example, the present positions of the planets, explains it in terms of it being caused by substances, the sun and the planets, acting at an earlier time with certain powers to cause material bodies to move in certain ways, and the liability to cause to exercise those powers. So both kinds of explanation explains phenomena in terms of the actions of substances, things, having certain powers to produce effects. But while personal explanation explains how substances exercise their powers because of their purposes and beliefs, inanimate explanation explains how substances exercise their powers because of their inevitable liabilities to do so. Right, we now move on to the second paragraph on the handout. To be cogent and describe the structure of explanation, I now wish to go into the criteria for believing some proffered explanation is probably true. To be cogent, probabilistic arguments, in the sense of arguments making the hypothesis substantially more probable than not, arguments of this kind must satisfy four criteria. First, the phenomena they cite as evidence must be ones which, it is to some modest degree, probable would occur if the hypothesis is true, and no phenomenon must be such that it is highly probable it would occur if the hypothesis were true. Not such that it would be such that it was improbable it would occur if the hypothesis is true. That is to say, the first criterion says you've got certain phenomena, you would expect them if the hypothesis is true. The hypothesis makes it fairly probable they would occur. There aren't any exceptions. Secondly, it must be the case that it must be much less probable that these phenomena would occur if the hypothesis is false. There must be things that you wouldn't expect if the hypothesis were false. Thirdly, the hypothesis must be simple. That is, it must postulate the existence and operation of few entities, few kinds of entities, few properties, few kinds of properties, each easily describable in terms of recognizable features of the world behaving in mathematically simple kinds of way. Fill that out in a minute. We can always postulate many new entities with complicated properties to explain anything we find, but our hypothesis will only be rendered probable by the evidence if it is a simple hypothesis which leads us to expect the various phenomena that form the evidence. And fourthly, the hypothesis must fit in with our knowledge of how the world works in wider fields, what I call background evidence. I now illustrate these criteria at work in assessing possible explanations. I consider first a personal explanation, that is, whereby we explain some historical event by the action of persons or. Suppose that there has been a burglary. Money has been stolen from a safe. There are the following pieces of evidence. John's fingerprints are found on the safe. Someone reports having seen John near the scene of the crime of the burglary at the time it was committed. And thirdly, an amount of money equivalent to the amount stolen is found in John's house. So the detective puts forward his hypothesis as the explanation of the burglary, the hypothesis that John robbed the safe. And you will see that it satisfies my criteria. If John did rob the safe, it would be moderately probable that his fingerprints would be on the safe. Someone might have report having seen him at the time near the scene of the crime when it was committed. And thirdly, that money of the amount stolen might be found in his house. So the the explanation satisfies the first criterion. But it's much less probable that these pieces of evidence would be observed if John did not rob the safe. Hence, the hypothesis satisfies the second criterion as well. But a hypothesis is only rendered probable by phenomena insofar as it is simple. Consider the following hypothesis as an explanation of the detective's evidence, a hypothesis that might be put forward by the defendant's lawyer. This, the defending lawyer says, we can easily explain these phenomena. David stole the money. Quite unknown to David, George dressed up to look like John at the time of the scene of the crime. Tony planted John's fingerprints on the safe just for fun. And, unknown to the others, Stephen had money stolen from another robbery, coincidentally of exactly the same amount, in John's house. If this hypothesis were true, it would be moderately probable that he would find all the positive evidence which I describe, while it remains not nearly as probable that we would find this evidence if the hypothesis were false. But this evidence does not make the complicated hypothesis in the least probable, although it does make the detective's original hypothesis that John robbed the safe probable, and that is for the reason that the detective's hypothesis is simple. Postulates just one substance, John, as the cause of all the miscellaneous kinds of evidence, rather than three or four agents acting in quite uncoordinated ways. So, first three criteria are well satisfied. But as well as evidence of the kind which I illustrated, there may be what I call background evidence. That is, evidence about matters which the hypothesis does not purport to explain, but comes from an area outside the scope of that hypothesis. We may have evidence about what John has done on other occasions. For example, evidence that John has often robbed safes in the past. This latter evidence would make the hypothesis that John robbed the safe on this occasion much more probable than it would be without this evidence. Conversely, evidence that John has lived a crime-free life in the past would make it less probable that he robbed the safe on this occasion. A hypothesis fits with such background evidence insofar as the background evidence makes probable a wider hypothesis, which in turn makes it probable that the hypothesis in question is true. Background evidence makes it probable that John is or isn't a regular safe robber. Right. Now, these same four criteria are at work in assessing postulated inanimate or scientific hypotheses. Newton's theory of gravitation, put forward in 1687, purported to explain many miscellaneous phenomena then known. Paths taken, given certain initial positions, by our moon, by the planets, by the moons of planets, the velocities with which bodies fall to the Earth, the motions of pendula, the occurrence of tides, etc., etc. Newton's theory consisted of his three laws of motion and his law of gravitational attraction, the inverse square law, which I just quoted earlier. These three laws were such as to make it very probable that these previously observed phenomena, which I have described, such as the positions of the Sun and planets in 1676, the earlier 10 years earlier, would be followed by various phenomena observed in 1687, such as the positions of the planets at that time. So the hypothesis led you to expect a lot of phenomena, miscellaneous phenomena. It would be very improbable that these same phenomena would occur if Newton's theory was false. No slightest reason to suppose they would occur if Newton's theory was false. There was no significant negative evidence. That is evidence which would make it improbable that the hypothesis is true. The theory was very simple, consisting of just three laws relating four properties: mass, distance, time, and force, ordinary quantities of which are ordinarily observable. That's to say, it's a simple property. It relates them to each other by the very simple mathematical relations, the least simple of which is the inverse square law. Yet innumerable other laws would have satisfied the first two criteria equally well, within the limits of accuracy then detectable. Any law in which you substitute a slightly different value for the 2 in the inverse square law, for example, if you substitute for it 2.000000974, would have satisfied the first two criteria as well as did the inverse square law. So too would a theory which postulated that the inverse square law held only until AD CE 2969, after which a quite different law, the cube law of attraction, would operate. Or you could have a theory containing a law that quite different forces operated outside the solar system. But Newton's law theory, unlike such theories, was rendered probable by the evidence just because it was a very simple theory, because it involved simpler mathematical numbers and relations. And I have an account of what the simplicity of mathematical numbers amounts to, which we could go into if you're interested. There was no relevant background evidence, my fourth criterion. Now, my fourth criterion says that when you are dealing with a fairly narrow phenomenon, such as who committed a burglary, you have to take into account wider evidence which isn't purportedly explained by it. But when you're dealing with an enormous physical theory which explains more, or purports to explain more or less everything is what it purports to explain, and so there is no wider evidence. Rephrasing Newton's laws in a more satisfactory way, um, the hypothesis is the hypothesis that the sun and each of the planets have simple powers and liabilities as codified in Newton's laws, and initial conditions which explain the present positions of the planets. That is to say, it is postulating the law is really a statement. Every material body, including the sun and the planets, has certain powers to attract each other body in a certain way. These powers are simple powers, and they are possessed by each uh, material body. Um, Given that, then it is a lot simpler than any hypothesis which says that everybody has different powers, and much simpler than any hypothesis that says that the powers that some bodies have are of a very complicated kind. I stress again the importance of this criterion of simplicity. There are always an infinite, and I mean infinite, number of mutually incompatible theories which could be so constructed as to predict any finite number of observed data when these would not otherwise be expected. Yet each of these infinite hypotheses will make different predictions from each other about what will happen tomorrow. Without the criterion of simplicity, it would be impossible to predict anything beyond what we immediately observe. If the hypothesis is concerned only with a narrow field, it has to fit in with any background evidence. But for many hypotheses, there may be no relevant background evidence, and the wider the scope of the hypothesis, that is, the more it purports to tell us about the world, the less background evidence there will be. For a very large-scale hypothesis of physics, such as quantum theory, there will be few physical phenomena apart from those within its scope, and so little, if any, ground evidence. Okay, now I'll talk about what uh, you have come to hear about, but this is crucial for understanding that. I now apply these four criteria to show that the most general features of the world are most probably explained by the action of God, and so they make it probable that there is a God. Now, if you look on the handout under E, I am now going to describe these features in more detail than I have done so far. These features are that there's a large physical universe. That is, it's governed almost entirely by simple laws of nature, the laws which, together with the initial boundary conditions of the universe, are such to make it very probable that they will lead to the evolution somewhere in the universe of human bodies, and an additional datum not explained by the physical laws that humans are conscious beings. I claim that each of these features contributes to the probability that there is a God, and that together they make it significantly more probable than not. So let's look at the hypothesis itself now, and that is 8 on the handout. Theism. The theory that there is a God of the traditional kind worshipped by Christians, Muslims, and Jews is clearly a personal hypothesis. The personal is a person. A person is a being who has powers to perform intentional actions. That is, actions which he or she means to do, beliefs and purposes. Theism is also a very simple hypothesis. It is simpler to suppose that the cause of the universe has zero limits to its power. That is, and to suppose that is to suppose that it is an omnipotent personal. Rather, it is simpler to suppose that the cause of the universe has zero limits to its power, rather than that, now refer to him as he now, than that he can only make a universe of a certain size and distance, a certain size and duration. And it is simpler to suppose that he has zero limits, backwardly or forwardly, to the length of his life, rather than he came into existence only 1 trillion years ago, or will live only for another 1 trillion years. And it is simpler to suppose that the above properties belong to God essentially, rather than that he has only them as fortunate accidents. So, the simplest cause of the universe, I was suggesting, is going to be an essentially everlasting, omnipotent being. It's a personal explanation. It's the simplest kind of personal explanation there could be. Was it postulates zero limits to power and zero limits to life? An omnipotent person can do any logically possible action, that is, any action which can be described without contradiction. So he cannot make me both exist and not exist at the same time, but since it makes no sense to suppose that I could both exist and not exist at the same time, the logically impossible action is not really an action at all, any more than an imaginary person is really a person. So theism is a very simple hypothesis, postulating the existence of one substance, one God, not many gods, who is essentially everlastingly omnipotent. I note in parentheses that Christianity, of course, claims that God is a trinity, three persons of one substance. And for this reason, Christians must regard my arguments, such as I am now beginning to provide, as arguments to the existence of God the Father, since on the Christian view of the Trinity, the other two persons are essentially consequences of his existence. Right. Bearing that in mind, I now assume one God. I now argue that all the other divine properties follow from his essential everlasting omnipotence. It follows from a substance being omnipotent that he will also be omniscient, in the sense that he will know everything logically possible for an omnipotent being to know. But this will not include knowledge of his own future actions, which he will freely decide which to do in the course of time. And it will, uh, otherwise, he will be omniscient, he will know everything, and he will not know what his future actions will be, nor will he know, should he give to any other creatures freedom, how they will exercise that freedom. He will also be perfectly good. This is because, to be truly omnipotent, that being must know what are all the alternative actions available to him to do, and so what properties are possessed by all states of affairs which he could cause. So he must know whether some state is good or bad. And I'm assuming a doctrine which is called moral internalism, that to believe some state of affairs, and so the action of causing it is good, necessarily gives an agent some inclination to do that action. And to believe that some state of affairs, and so the action of causing it is bad, necessarily gives an agent some inclination not to do that action. And you couldn't really believe, in the true sense of good, you couldn't really believe that some action is good to do unless you had some inclination to do it when it's easily possible for you to do it. nor could you believe it to be bad unless you had some inclination not to do it. Humans, however, have, who have moral beliefs are also subject to counter inclinations, desires to do what is bad as well as what is good. And so we have to choose on which of these inclinations to act. But a simple omnipotent being cannot be subject to inclinations which are incompatible with his essential nature. And this includes always being moved by the goodness of actions because he can see that goodness of actions, and, and always being moved not to do bad actions because he could see the badness of those actions, and that he can see that follows from his omniscience. So, such a being will also be perfectly free in the sense of being able to do any logically possible action, but that will not include doing evil actions. God can do no evil, since a perfectly good being doing an evil action is not logically possible, and his perfect goodness is part of his nature. Such a God will also be omnipresent in the sense of knowing everything about what is happening at every place without needing to infer it from anything happening nearer to himself, and also be able to bring about any effect at any place without needing to do it by making something happen nearer to himself. So the hypothesis of theism that there is an essentially everlastingly omnipotent being is a very simple hypothesis and satisfies very well our third criteria for being a probably true hypothesis. But what does God's perfect goodness involve? What sort of a universe will we expect to find if there is a God? Now, at this point, we are on the last paragraph of my handout, at the beginning of it. There is a highly plausible principle called the Dionysian principle, that goodness is by its very nature diffusive of itself and thereby of being. It follows from that principle that God might well make other good beings. Humans are good beings. We are embodied rational creatures with limited powers to make the world different in various ways. And we have one power which God himself does not have. That is, the power freely to make ourselves, each other, and the physical world either better or worse. If we are good parents, we seek to give our children enough freedom to rebel against us if they so choose. But of course, we hope that they will not so choose. God can do no evil, but it is good that God should create rational creatures free to decide how to exercise their limited powers to act in ways that God does not choose. Limited powers, of course, so that those humans do not do too much damage. So there is this special reason why it's probable that God might make a world in which there are beings like us. But if God is to create us, he must provide a universe in, and here we are on the last part of that last paragraph of the handout. But of course, if God is to create us, he must produce a universe in which we can exercise our choices to benefit or harm ourselves and each other in familiar, limited ways. For this purpose, we need a public universe in which each of us occupies a movable place we can move. And so we must have bodies which occupy places where we can get hold of each other or escape from each other, and which limit our powers, since everything we do depends on our bodies, and our control of the universe is limited to what can be done by moving parts of our bodies. So we need bodies if we are to be that sort of being. But only if there are simple regularities which we can discover in the way things behave, things ourselves, other than ourselves, behave, Will there be ways in which my moving a bodily part in this or that way will make a predictable difference to me or others? And so only in that way can we have an effective choice of how to treat ourselves, each other, and the world beyond our bodies. For example, if humans know that by sowing seeds, watering and weeding them, they can get corn, then they have the power to develop an agriculture. And if they also know that by rubbing sticks together they can make fire, they will be able, if they so choose, to burn the food supplies of their enemies. We have to know how things will behave when we move our bodies in certain ways to cause effect in the world. And so there have to be simple regularities in the way things behave. But simple, observable regularities are only possible if the fundamental laws are simple ones. And so, if God is to create us, God must create a universe governed by simple laws if we are to be the sort of beings that it's good he should create. Further, if God is to create embodied humans, these laws must be such as to allow the existence of human bodies, either brought about by an evolutionary process or created directly by God. And finally, if God is to create us, God must endow those human bodies with consciousness, a consciousness which controls those bodies. And so, because it's quite probable that God will create us, it's quite probable that that all the four phenomena which I have described will occur if there is a God. And so, of course, they're evident phenomena, and they certainly do occur. So, the hypothesis of theism satisfies very well my first criterion for a probably true hypothesis, given the four kinds of evidence which I am considering. Sorry, excuse me a moment. I lost that one. 8:11. Um, yeah. There is a highly, yeah. Um, but if God is to create us, he must provide a universe. I'm so sorry, I've lost once again the place. Yes. 13. Um, many pages here. Um, hmm, yeah. But it's coming on to the second criterion. If there is no God, and since any rival supernatural hypothesis would be much more complicated than theism, it is immensely improbable that these phenomena will occur in the natural course of things. Unless you suppose that there's some explanation of it, there's no reason to suppose there would be a large physical universe at all. Even if there is one, there is no reason to suppose that it will be subject to simple laws of nature rather than being totally chaotic. Although, even without God, it might be more probable that there would be simple laws rather than complicated ones. Since simple laws are ultimately analyzable in terms of the powers and liabilities of individual substances, what it supposes is enormously improbable. It is enormously improbable that if there is no God, then all the innumerable substances, for example, all the atoms in the universe, have exactly the same powers and liabilities as each other. Just reflect on that. Every atom in the universe has exactly the same powers to attract every other one as every other atom. And this is an enormous coincidence crying out for an explanation. Yet it is that fact which makes it possible for there to be regularities in the behavior of large-scale physical objects through which creatures of moderate intelligence can act, can understand these simple regularities and use them to make a difference to the world. And then, my third phenomenon, it's immensely improbable that even if the laws were such as to produce a universe in which there are simple regularities, um, it's mostly very improbable that those simple regularities and the simple laws underlying them would be such as to bring about human bodies. And you, you will have seen, many of you will know of recent scientific work which has drawn attention to what is called the fine tuning of the universe. This is the fact that the constant, that is some particular fixed number, which occurs in all the formulations of the laws of nature, the constant of the laws by which the physical objects of the universe are governed needs to lie within a very, very small interval of its actual value if there are to be human bodies. For example, the constant in the law of gravity, G, needs to lie within 1 part of 10 to the power 26. That's 10 times 10 times 10, 26, 36 times 1 over that of the range of values of the constants in the other laws if there are to be human beings. And even if all of this occurred by chance, as far as any currently plausible scientific laws are concerned, the laws might just as easily have given rise to robots. Some contemporary physicists, I should add, defend a multiverse theory. That is, a theory which an enormous space throws up from time to time universes in which there are laws of nature of different kinds to the ones in our universe. And so they say it's not improbable that sometime or other this multiverse will have thrown up a universe like ours. But even if that were so, it is immensely improbable that there would be a multiverse of this kind, which has the characteristic of producing at some stage a universe like ours, when almost all the logically possible multiverses you can imagine would not have that characteristic. That's to say, if you say the regularities, the constants having the values they do, um, well, there are lots and lots of other universes produced by this big space, and they have different constants, so maybe it's a chance matter that one time or other a universe like ours will appear. Well, nobody's produced a scientific theory showing how that could be. But even if they did, the immediate question is, why should the multiverse which they postulate be true by chance? Because there are innumerable multiverses which wouldn't throw up a universe like ours. And so the same objection arises. Right. And finally, my fourth phenomenon, consciousness. Consciousness is totally improbable unless there is a creator who gave it to us. For human bodies to be the bodies of conscious beings, there must be innumerable different laws, other than the laws of physics as we know them, connecting different brain events with different conscious events, different sensations, current thoughts, different intentions. And science has not yet discovered these laws, but if it had, there would have to be an enormous number of them, and there's not the slightest reason to suppose that just those laws would evolve which would make consciousness of any use to us. But of course, God has reason to bring about such complicated laws in order thereby to bring about human beings. Human type consciousness is totally improbable unless there is a creator who created physical objects inbuilt with such complicated powers to produce particular thoughts, feelings, and intentions under particular circumstances. I conclude that the hypothesis of theism satisfies very well my second criterion for a probable theory. It satisfies, I have earlier demonstrated, my criterion very well for my first criterion very well, and that it is a very simple theory. Finally, theism is such a wide-ranging hypothesis, it purports to explain all the most general features of the universe, and so we need not take any account of it. So, I've talked about the positive evidence for the existence of God. Now, it's only rational to believe a hypothesis is probable on the total evidence. We must take into account everything we know. And I have not considered all sorts of other evidence of a positive kind, nor have I considered very important apparent negative evidence, the existence of much evil in the world. Why, people ask, if there is a good God, would it be probable that there would be such evil? And surely this counts against the satisfaction of my first criterion for the probability of theism. My view is that this evidence neither counts for nor against the existence of God, since, I shall argue, it is equally probable that a perfectly good God would create either a universe which contains this or a universe which does not contain this. There are in the world two sorts of evil: moral evil, that is, evil caused to occur or negligently allowed to occur by us, and natural evil, which is evil not caused or negligently allowed to occur by the action of us. On the hypothesis of theism, there is moral evil because God gives to humans the free will to do either what is good or what is evil, and so allows them freely to choose good instead of being programmed to do good. In this way, God makes us mini creators. We choose to a limited extent what sort of world we are to live in, and also the sort of people we are to be, because each time we make a good choice, it is easier to make a good choice next time. And conversely, each time we make a bad choice, it is easier to make a bad choice next time. And thereby, we form our own characters. And God provides natural evil, that is, the evil not caused by us, such as disease and accidents and so on, in order to force many serious choices on us which we otherwise would not have. If I get ill, my friends have the choice of whether to neglect me or not, and I have the choice of how to deal with my illness by patience and cheerfulness, or not. Natural evil provides us with the serious choices between which we can make that difference to ourselves and our characters. However, this is a very brief account of my response to a difficult question, and the subsequent seminar tomorrow will provide an opportunity to probe this matter more deeply. Meanwhile, I hope that I have shown you my reasons for believing that the most general features of the universe, which I have described, make it significantly more probable than not that there is God. Thank you. questions and objections to this. Um, yeah,
Shall we begin with the?
if you ask in Montenegrin, it will be translated for me.
So I would like to open the floor for maybe the gentleman will like a microphone. Okay. I can speak louder. Excuse me, gentleman in the back row has, and then I've noted you, and you will receive the microphone later.
Hello, Sir Swinburne. It's a pleasure to hear you talk. It's just as complicated listening to you through YouTube and in real life. So, a part of your argument is that consciousness can prove God. In a sense, if we are conscious creatures, then God must have given us this consciousness.
Yeah.
Why couldn't consciousness be explained simply as a computing problem? In a sense, if through evolution we just brains become more and more complicated until a switch turns on and we become conscious instead of being it given to us by a divine being. Thank you.
How would you switch things on? It's very important to bear in mind that there are two kinds of events in the world. Can you hear me? Yeah. Physical events and mental events. And the difference between them is this. Physical events are ones to which there is public access. Anyone can find out about them as well as anyone else. That there is a bottle on this table is a public event. You can find it out as well as I can or anyone else. But the other events, mental events, are ones such that one person has privileged access to them in the sense that by experience, that one person knows that they are happening. And whatever other evidence anyone else can have about them, I could have about what makes me, I could have, and yet I'm one step ahead of anyone else. I can know what I'm thinking. You can know what I'm thinking, perhaps by the way I behave, even possibly by studying my brain. But even if you do know about it by studying my brain, I could know about it by studying my brain. But I've one step above that. I'd know about it by actually doing the thinking. And so there's two sorts of event. And the world has to God is to create consciousness, he must create beings who have these sorts of events. Now, it's possible that there may be laws of nature which connect physical events, goings on in the brain, with certain sorts of conscious events. I'm not ruling that out. But I am ruling out that there's any simple laws of this kind because conscious events differ from each other in innumerable ways. I mean, to start with, we can have sensations of green or red or yellow or whatever, and there's no simple analysis in which you can analyze the one by the other. And likewise, when you consider thoughts that people have, you can't analyze their thoughts in terms of simple units, which you can analyze other thoughts in terms of. And this contrasts very sharply with physical events, because the ultimate constituents of the universe, physics will tell you, have only half a dozen properties. They have mass, they have charge, they have volume, they have distance from other objects. Possibly they have color, charge, and spin. Maybe there are one or two others, but half a dozen or eight, every physical object is composed of. And therefore, you can have laws which govern all physical objects because they show how they vary in mass and a charge and how that will make a difference to their behavior. But the constituents in terms of which the laws are formulated are a very simple number. Now, if there were to be laws which connect brain events with conscious events, the conscious events don't have that characteristic. They can't be analyzed in terms of simple components. So they're going to be millions of such laws. Well, there may be. I'm not ruling that out. But God has got to produce a universe in which there are those millions of your laws, and they're not likely to turn up by chance in such a way as to be of any use to us. So that's the answer to that.
Thank you. Could you raise, yeah.
Thank you very much for
Any other? Okay, so there is the gentleman.
thanks. So I have two questions, if I'm allowed to
One
ask
at
two.
a time.
Oh, one at a time. Okay. So let's start just with this condition too. So some people argued that apart from the personal explanation and the inanimate explanation, there might be an inanimate explanation which, apart from the powers and liabilities, includes teleology. So it includes purposes as essential feature of the universe. I know, of course, that you don't think that view is true, but I'm just wondering whether you think that the view is logically coherent. Would it be the case?
I've lost who you are. You're talking to me.
The gentleman.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes. And I'm very sorry. I must ask you just to repeat that.
No problem. So some people argue that apart from the inanimate and the personal explanation, there could be an explanation which is inanimate, but they are apart from the powers and the liabilities also teleology. So the purposes inbuilt in things, such as the purpose of the universe. So it wouldn't be then just a massive fluke that we are here, or that there is a physical universe, that there is value, or that there is consciousness, but there is a teleology inbuilt in things. So this would be something like Aristotelian view. So I'm just wondering whether you think that view is logically coherent. Of course, I know you don't subscribe to that view, but I'm just wondering whether you think there is a coherence to that view.
Well, as I was using the words purpose and belief and so on, they're the sort of things of which we are conscious. Uh, of course, one does talk about in a psychoanalytic context of subconscious beliefs and subconscious intentions, but they're only subconscious in the sense that they're the sort of things that can be brought to life with the aid of a psychiatrist. But the idea that there can be purposes, that a thing can have purposes, which it's no way aware of since it's not conscious at all, does seem to me a little difficult to understand to start with. But also totally unnecessary because there is this rival explanation of why there are purposes, is God's purposes. And that explanation is a great deal simpler than postulating that every individual thing has one further property, coincidentally, dovetailing, as it were, with the properties of the other things to produce this effect. So it would be a very complicated hypothesis. It doesn't look like a complicated hypothesis if you just call it pantheism. But when you boil it down to what it's postulating, it becomes very complicated because it postulates an extra power possessed by an infinite number of things. And that's my answer.
Okay. Is there any? The gentleman in the back. I'm so sorry. Would you like to go first, and then the gentleman in the back after you?
Is it on? First of all, I want to welcome you to Montenegro, Professor, and to thank you for your lecture. It was great. And while you were speaking, I got this idea that because you're using physics a lot in your speech, I got this idea that, and I have this question for you. Have you ever thought of the Holy Trinity as a principle of superposition?
The Holy Trinity of superposition. Well, simple theories often have complicated consequences, and it's no objection to a simple theory if you can deduce these complicated consequences. I mean, if there is solution to the three-body problem. It will be a very complicated consequence of Newton's theory and so on, but that's no objection to it, that it's complicated, so long as you can derive it from a simple theory. Now, I'll give you my argument for the Trinity very briefly. The doctrine of the Trinity is that there are, as it were, three personal components in God, in one God. If you start with the hypothesis and that the Son is caused to exist by the Father, and that the Spirit proceeds from, and there is a slight difference, only very marginal difference, and nothing turns on it, from the Father and or the Son in the Western tradition. So it's quite acceptable to Orthodox to say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, and there's no real difference between through the Son and from the Father and the Son. So, bearing that in mind, what will a perfect being do? A perfect being will wish to have someone to share with. That will be a virtue of his perfect goodness. You want to share perfect goodness. And so he will want to bring about an equal to himself, and hence the Son. But twosome can be a bit selfish. And what a perfectly good father would want to do is to have someone else equally powerful who would love his son as he does and be loved by him. It is, I mean, the analogy is marriage. In producing a third entity in marriage, you are not merely producing someone for you to look after. You want them to have the good of being looked after and looking after a third person. You want their goodness to be recognized by someone else and to be loved by and to love someone else. Otherwise, the union is a bit selfish. Okay, so three is the necessary minimum for a good God to exercise in virtue of his perfect goodness. And it uh, follows necessarily from the nature of God. It's not a voluntary act like creating us is a voluntary act. Okay, so why only three? And the answer to that is this. If it's before God, there is ever a choice of an infinite number of actions, each of one is better than the other, but there is no best. How shall a perfect being act? He cannot do the logically possible of doing the best possible because there is no best possible. So, just to do any good act within the scope, suppose, for example, having elephants is a good thing. There is no maximum number of elephants that he could create, yet every elephant is one more good thing in the world. And so God's perfect goodness with respect to elephants would consist in just producing some elephants. That's the best he could do. Okay, now, so in producing beings like to himself, um, uh, he can't produce the best number, or it looks as if he can't produce the best number, because there is no best number. But if he is to exercise his goodness in creating someone other than the Son to love and be loved by, then he must create at least three, follows from his nature. But it then also follows that if he did create a fourth, that wasn't necessary for the existence of unselfish love, or a fifth, or a sixth. But then it would be a voluntary act of God to create another one. But of course, any being created by a voluntary act of God would not exist necessarily in virtue of the very nature of God. And so, although a threesome is the minimum number necessary for um, uh, unselfish love, it is also the maximum number necessary for um, a divine being to have, because otherwise any divine beings would have been created voluntarily, and that can't make them divine. Now, that's a very thick argument, yet you'll find it in print somewhere, and that's my answer to that question.
Thank you. We have the gentleman in the back and the gentleman there. So maybe we should go, or should we take two questions at one or one by one?
One at
One at a time, please. Okay.
Hello, welcome to Montenegro. Your line of reasoning about multiverses supposes that in order to have a good omnipotent being, there should be only one universe. Can that be related or translated to, in order to have a good universe, then only one kind, human or humankind or mankind, should be created parallel to what you said about multiverses. Only one kind of conscious beings in the universe. Otherwise, otherwise it's not good, right? Same as your reasoning with multiverses. And to that line about consciousness, you already said, we're witnessing the emergence of AGI, of different technologies, and the thought experiment about von Neumann's probes is coming to life before our eyes, basically. Like you couple a 3D printer with AGI and you have a von Neumann's probe, which are not showing up, right? So if you could elaborate on
Yes,
uniqueness of consciousness from this argument perspective.
Yes, you have a number of different points there, I think. Or artificial intelligence. I don't rule out on logical grounds at all that conscious beings might be produced in a non-sexual way. That seems to be logically possible. I think it's morally undesirable, but I think it's to be logically possible. And even beings who, like us, could make rational choices. Of course, it will only happen if God has allowed it to happen. And if he has, well, he has. I don't see any deep theological reason why that shouldn't be the case. Of course, theology has usually proceeded on the basis that there is only one finite sort of rational creature, and that is creatures who have the same biology as ourselves. But I don't see it's contrary to the doctrine of God the limited doctrine of God as I have expounded it, that he should create universes with other sorts of rational beings in them. Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. There's no evidence that he has at the moment, but he might. And uh, why should he not? I don't see any objection to that. Since we don't know anything about it, we can't do anything about it, and it's not very relevant to us, except as a logical possibility. But I don't see any objection to it.
Sir?
Thank you. Dear Professor Swinburne, at the very beginning, allow me to say that your lecture today is great compliment not only to the hosts, University of Montenegro, but also to the entire Montenegrin academic society, especially for those who are thinking on religion not in or paradigm, but in and paradigm, and among them myself uh, had the privilege to be today here and to listen your lecture. I have rather reflection than question upon your today's lecture, namely. Uh, my question relates more to monotheism than theism, and relates more to interreligious dialogue and relations than uh, to relations between religion and science. From the point of view of someone who thinking about religion in this and then way, I'm thinking also about the different revealed religions, Abrahamic religions in this way. So your natural theology as the philosophical background, all your arguments you mentioned at the very beginning of your lecture, uh, sounds like some parts from the last revelation, actually the Honorable Quran book, in which actually natural theology is suggested as the way of understanding of evidences of God's presence all around us, on the earth and above it, on the sky. Moreover, in 20th and 21st century, science confirmed the science based on exclusive rationalism confirmed some evidences from the Honorable Quran, starting with, for example, Big Bang, when we are talking about the beginning of creation. Then, for example, phases of human embryo or position of sun and moon in the cosmos. And there is a clear guidance, clear suggestion in this holy book to follow changes in the nature and the changes in the cosmos to understand God's creation. Now, finally, my question is, what do you think about this following paradox? Today's Christianity inclines or searching for compromises with this exclusive rationalism in our modern society, especially after the Second Vatican Council, rather than seeking to common denominator with Islam, which is the closest religion to Christianity. I would like to hear from your point of view, what do you think about this paradox? Thank you very
Well, you're quite right. Almost everything I said would be accepted by Islam until I came to the Trinity. And that is, of course, to be welcomed. And some of the um, Islamic thinkers of the between the 9th and the 11th centuries adumbrated some of these arguments. They were all, they say, in the Christian tradition from Athanasius onwards, but they're developed in interesting ways by the Arabic thinkers. Um, and of course, Judaism, before both of these things, you will find, I think, by the end of in the last 700 years of Judaism before Christ, there was the idea of God as omnipotent and knowing everything and being everywhere and so on. So what you're asking me about is first Eastern religions and secondly new religions. Um, Eastern religion, and in particular Buddhism, um, doesn't go in for arguments for its truth very much, quite honestly. It goes in for practice. Um, and if you ask them what grounds they got for believing that we shall be reincarnated in a certain sort of way, um, they might cite the evidence of a few Indian children. I'm sorry, it sounds a bit sarcastic, but it's not meant to, um, who purport to remember their past life, but these things haven't been very thoroughly examined as to the extent to which they got that knowledge from elsewhere. So I don't think there is very much evidence for the truth of anything in the Eastern tradition. But there is the ideals of unselfishness very strongly emphasized. Um, One thing about Buddhism I don't like very much, and it comes out in some other Eastern religions, is that they tend to think that it's a good thing always never to do what you want to do. That is to say, you have to eliminate desire. I think it's a very good thing to do what you want to do, unless what you want to do is going to harm you from doing anything better. And often it is, of course. But subject to that, desires are good things. So I'm not very keen on Eastern religions, either for the sort of life they commend or for their justification for leading it. Well, we've got a few modern philosophical ideas around, of which pantheism was mentioned, and I gave my reason for rejecting that. What is called panentheism doesn't differ, differs, it seems to me, only in one rather crucial respect, in that God is supposed to have a body which he's inevitably tied to. And that seems to me a very considerable limitation on God, because what a body is something through which we have to act and uh, by which we are influenced. But such a panentheistic God would not be able to abolish the universe at a sweep and create another one because he, he's tied to his body, and that's this universe. And that is not nearly as simple as the hypothesis I'm putting forward. So that briefly why I am rejecting these alternatives.
Thank you. As we near the end of our Q&A session, I would like to take the opportunity to ask you a question. So in your work, as well as in today's lecture, you defend and you postulate a certain metaphysics, and which, as far as I understood it, implies a certain theory of truth, which again, in turn, as I understood it, implies a certain theory of meaning. And in relation to that, I have a question, because this is an institute full of social scientists mostly. So from a social scientific perspective, there is a paradigm that has been tremendously influential in all aspects of thinking about the world, about society and social action, namely post-structuralism. It is the idea, to bring it a little closer to our guests, that the meaning of words is not necessarily anchored in a referent, but rather that it is relational or differential, that it depends on the meaning of other words. Okay. So my question for you is, how do you square your methodological and conceptual approach with the post-structuralist view of how meaning is generated? Is it compatible? Is it incompatible? To what degree can you somehow reconcile your perspective with it? What do you think about it? And maybe as a kind of reflection, is it possible to be a post-structuralist Christian? Thank you.
Well, if all it amounts to is the view that meaning of words and so of sentences, you couldn't grasp the meaning unless you grasp the meaning of certain other words and sentences, then sure, I don't see any objection to that. If it's the view that you can only understand the meaning of words and sentences by their relation to others, then that is self-defeating, because uh, I mean, if you could only understand A by B and B by C and C by D, how on earth are you to enter this circle? Um, and the answer is that there are two ways in which we can come to understand the meaning of words. Some of them more prominent with respect to some words than others. Um, you're not going to understand the word red unless you have a certain sort of experience, color experience. And there, of course, you need to fit it into ordinary language by pointing out that it's the sort of thing that red is the sort of thing you see when you're looking at that, and green is the sort of thing you see when you're looking at that, and so on. But to suggest that you could only understand them if you the only way to understand them is to understand the way other words is used is clearly false. You couldn't enter the circle. But given that you, for most words, some words you entirely understand by their definitions by others. For some words, you need certain sorts of paradigm examples. And but sure, but that's perfectly compatible with everything I've said. All the words I've used, this is true of. These are all words that we understand. Um, we understand the word person by, well, we are persons, and why are we persons? Well, because we are uh, embodied rational beings. What do you mean by embodied? Having a body. What's a body? This is a body. It's some, but also it's what I control and so on. How do I know what control is? Well, I point to certain other paradigm examples. There's nothing mysterious about the words I use. They confer, they are appropriate to the sort of words anyone uses. It's no new discovery here.
Okay. Okay. So I guess this is the last question we can have. The young gentleman and the
One
has
more?
a
Yeah.
one more question and then we're done.
Well, I can't go on forever. I've got to see these other people here.
So
Right.
please find the time. Thank
Thank you, Mr. Swinburne, for visiting us. It's me.
Yeah.
So during your lecture, you mentioned the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. And as far as I'm acquainted with the argument, it uses a specific theory of mathematical probability called the Bayesian theory of probability. And most people who don't agree with this argument, they attack it on base of saying, for example, well, it's a subjective theory of probability. It's not like the objective one, like, for example, frequency theory and prosperity theory of probability. So how would you answer this objection and the problem of, I guess, assessing these probabilities and distributing these probabilities within the formula of Bayesian? Yeah. Thank you.
I just have to say one or two things to explain it to the rest of the audience. I think there are three senses of probability, three ways in which the word probable is used. I was using it in what is known as the epistemic sense, or sometimes inductive or a sense. That is to say, the probability on this evidence that that will be true, the probability on this evidence that that scientific theory is true. And it might not be true on another set of evidence, probability that he did the crime on that evidence, but not on this new piece of evidence. Okay. But probability is also used in two other senses. First, you talk of the probability of an A being a B, in which you are talking about simply the proportion of A's which are B, maybe the proportion in a finite class or the proportion in an infinite class. If it's a proportion in infinite class, then all you can do is provide the epistemic probability that the objective probability will have this value. But you also need it, the word probability, in a sense of a sense that it's a measure of the determinism in nature. That is to say, if everything that happens is caused inevitably by something else, then the probability that it will occur is 1, and the probability that something else instead will occur is 0. But if, as it were, there is indeterminism in nature, then you can measure the indeterminism, and if the indeterminism is a photon, a particle of light, will go through this slit or that slit. It might be a half, it'll go through this slit. It might be a half, it'll go through that slit. It's a measure of the indeterminism in nature. Now, I was talking about epistemic probability, and there is a formulation of this with which I entirely agree, called the Bayesian formulation, a formulation that was put forward in the 19th century, originates from Pascal, in which all the theorems of probability follow from 4 or 6 axioms. Okay, now most people who produce textbooks on this or talk about this say that the values we attribute to the probability of A on B or the probability of A when you don't have any evidence and so on are purely subjective. Each of us has different probability value. That is, if that were true, then science would be impossible. Um, because scientists are not talking about probability theorists or mathematicians, but people who predict events, predict that there will be an eclipse of the sun tomorrow or something. And some nutter comes along and says, no, there won't be. We know that very probably there will be, and we know that because we have judged scientific theories by the criteria which I have stated. And I have tried to capture exactly the criteria which are used in actual scientific assessment of probabilities and detective and forensic ones and historical ones and so on. And they, I think, are the ones that I have put forward. I didn't spell out the criterion of mathematical simplicity, but I could do so fairly easily. If you talk to me afterwards, I don't think everybody will be interested in this. But if there are no such criteria, then any scientific theory which was compatible with the evidence, or any historical theory that was compatible with the evidence, which is such that if the theory is true, you would expect it, and there's no other reason to expect it, would be as probable as any other. And there will be an infinite number of these theories. So every prediction you make, you can make any prediction you like. I mean, ordinary language, ordinary talk example of this is what's known as conspiracy theories. Who killed Kennedy, who stole the election, etc. You can always make up a theory which would explain all the evidence that's been produced. I think climate change is the best model example. Climate change deniers claim they can explain everything that the climate scientists come up with. And they can if the only two criteria are, do they lead you to expect the evidence? Yes, they do. Have you got any reason to suppose the evidence would occur in the natural course of things? No, you don't. But what makes all the difference is that they have to give special sorts of explanation to the different phenomena which the ordinary climate scientist puts forward, and therefore their total package is a very complicated one. That's why we dismiss them. So they are objective, and subjective Bayesians may indeed capture you or my subjective abilities, but what they mean, we mean, or ought to mean, by someone's individual subjective probabilities are the values of probability which that particular individual ascribes to events. But I am concerned with whether that individual gets it right. And if science is possible, there must be such objective criteria. Okay.
Well, on behalf of the organizers, I would like to once again thank Professor Swinburne for his time and for the lecture. Please, round of applause. Thank you all very much for coming.
I'm giving 3 copies of this to the university, and there's a slightly longer version of what I've been telling you.